Welcome, everyone. I'm really delighted to welcome Amber Cushing to our campus. Amber is currently a professor at University College Dublin, but she's also a Simmons alum and has many New England ties because she did her undergraduate work at Mount Holyoke, and her family lives in New Hampshire.
I grew up in New Hampshire. I did,
okay.
Concord, New Hampshire.
Concord, New Hampshire. Amber did her doctoral work at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and she'll be happy to tell you about the UNC Dublin program that started last year at the end of her talk, if you're interested in that. And I just found out talking to her this afternoon that she's going to give a TED Talk Ireland very shortly. So this will be your warm-up
December
act.
3rd is December 3rd.
Okay,
But it won't be online until after that.
All right, so look for her on TED and YouTube after that. Amber's been the recipient of several fellowships and as a faculty member of research grants from the Irish Research Council. And I wrote down some of the areas she's done research in because it's a very interesting array of subjects. So she has expertise in digital objects and digital records management, but she's also interested in personal information management, preservation of digital records, digital objects and their possession, or possession thereof, and participatory cultural heritage. So a lot of areas that we're very interested in here at Simmons. I should also add that she was a contestant on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in 2013, and I'm sure she'll be happy to tell you about that experience. So without further ado, thank you so much for being here today, and welcome, Amber.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So today, I just want to tell you a little bit about one of my recent projects. I generally always take the title from my participant quotes when I do interviews because I think it expresses the title really well. So this one is called "We've No Problem Inheriting That Knowledge Onto Other People," very somewhat Irish phrase, exploring the characteristics of motivation for attending a participatory archives event. So I'll start by talking a little bit about participatory archives. So I'm not sure what everyone's familiarity would be with them. I'll talk about the case, which was DRI, the Digital Repository of Ireland, and their Inspiring Ireland 1916 project. My findings, which are the motivations of participants for attending participatory archives events, and then larger issues from the findings. So a little bit of background here. The word participatory archives or archives 2.0 is sort of floated around since around 2010, 2009 or so. Kate Timer, who more focused on archives practice, dubbed this term archives 2.0. And she called it a shift in archival thinking and practice. And a lot of this 2.0 involved things like archives having blogs, or archives being on social media, or perhaps allowing users to comment on collections, and maybe including that in arrangement description, these user comments. All of these things that are probably super standard right now that we never thought archives didn't have. But at one time they didn't have them, and it was a very new thing. So Alexandra Evely has done other work in 2015 and 2017, and she focused on crowdsourcing, but also looked at crowdsourcing from the archivist's perspective. And she said that engaging non-archivists through the medium of social web technology to contribute or comment on archival practice was really her definition of crowdsourcing in the archival realm. And she specifically made that a little broader than Kate Timer's definition, and encompassing all of social web technology. And the contributing was really a key factor there. So we also have some earlier work about some scholars who have offered some participatory archives models, starting with Shilton and Srinivasan in 2007, and they were actually at UCLA. And their participants, they asked their participants to share information about themselves and their lives and upload those, uploading those personal documents, And then they were said in this participatory archives model, they would have focus groups to gather context or metadata, and that these focus groups would do this sort of community appraisal type thing. And this idea was to kind of pluralize archives and make them more representative by seeking out members of different communities. So that's the model they offered. Fast forward to 2008, Iso Kuvila, he came up with this participatory archives definition that had several pillars involving shared curation responsibilities, meaning the archivist and also the users would share some responsibility in this oversight and archival practice. And also, what was really important in this model was that usability would be equal to preservation tasks. So he had pointed out that archivists spend way too much time on arrangement and description when they really need to focus a lot on usability and engaging the users, and he wanted to see that those have equal weighting in archival practice. We fast forward again to 2016, the latest kind of stab at this participatory archives model. Roland out of, I think he's at Monash, or at least in Australia. And he mapped participatory archives to the records continuum, which some of you may be familiar with at this point. And what he did was come up with dimensions of participation. So he said that it's not just everybody participating. There are people who participate because the records are about them, or they see themselves in the records, or perhaps they're historians who just want to use the records for another pursuit, or perhaps the records aren't necessarily about them, but again, they're about their heritage or in some way. So there were these kind of levels of participation. So this is kind of what's out there so far for participatory archives in a nutshell. We have some models and we have some thinking around it. So what I pulled from that, and Michelle mentioned that I had done some work in personal information management and personal archiving. What I noticed was there were some similarities with personalization of personal archiving. So specifically, Emily points out that online participation could contribute to personalizing the archives experience. So she linked this participation with personalizing the experience. So there's that. And then a lot of others, specifically Kokiolo and Rabina. Personalization can increase satisfaction, perceived value of a collection, as well as increase understanding of a historical event. So what I did was I looked at this participatory archives models and the knowledge and archives 2.0 and all of that. And then I looked at the kind of personalization elements there. And I was kind of curious as to how these two kind of interplayed with each other. And then after I did that, and I recognized those points, then I moved to the personal archiving literature. And I wanted to see what the personal archiving literature could tell us about motivation. Because in general, we don't see a lot of writing in archives about users' motivations. We see user studies, of course, why users come to the archive and use things, or why they use the website. But other than that, we don't really know why they might want to participate. So we have all these models that say that they can participate, but we don't know why they want to actually do that, and that was my question. So I went to some of the personal archiving literature, and Summa Kamish, which some of you may have read, some individuals perceived personal record keeping as a kind of witnessing, or a way to memorialize a life. So I thought about, okay, well maybe that's a motivation. And then Kirk and Sellin, who are actually writing more in the HCI literature, they identified 6 values associated with the behavior of home archiving. And this is in their example, it was digital. So defining the self, forgetting, fulfilling duty, framing the family, and connecting with the past and honoring those we care about. So again, the personal archiving literature is valuable here because it tells us something about motivation. So it's not motivation to participate in an event, but it is motivation to engage in archiving. And that's a good place to start as far as I thought. So that brings me to my research question, my overarching research question, which was, what motivates non-professionals to participate in a participatory archives event? And when I say non-professionals, I don't mean like incognito genealogists or incognito archivists who love archives so much that they do it in their free time too. I'm talking about people who don't have any training in this field and wouldn't ever consider themselves an information professional in any way. So with that, I needed a case, and I was fortunate enough to be able to work with the Digital Repository of Ireland. They actually approached me and said, we're doing this participatory project called Inspiring Ireland 1916. And she explained it, the director explained it as they wanted to blend public and personal narratives about 1916. And I'll tell you what 1916 is in a minute. But it was, she explained to me there was this idea where she wanted people's personal collections to be digitally captured so that they could be integrated with institutional collections at a couple of different institutions in Dublin. The National Library of Ireland, the National Museum, and so forth, the DRI as well. She wanted to do this interweaving thing so we can see this institutional item, personal item, and they can help us understand the story better for this series of online exhibits. And this is really what this project was about. Participants were asked to bring treasures about 1916 to be digitally captured and preserved by the DRI. I kind of cringe when I hear that word treasures because I think it connotes this weird kind of Indiana Jones thing about archives, which is not fully accurate. But anyway, this was her thing. And she had contacted our school, and she said, well, I really need some student volunteers. Do you know any students who would be interested in kind of volunteering with this project? And I said, I do, but I would actually really be interested in potentially talking to some of the people who come to this event. And she said, okay, well, we can work something out, get maybe like 10 students, and I'll see what I can do. And it did, it worked really well. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I do want to tell you about the 1916 Easter Rising and the centenary. So for those of you who aren't like well-versed in modern Irish history, which I wasn't until I got to Dublin, the 1916 Easter Rising is largely associated with the Irish independence movement, the first kind of spark of the Irish independence movement to gain independence from Great Britain. And if I wanted to make an analogy, I would say it's very similar to kind of Lexington and Concord, if I can make a local analogy. And I say that because this is something that all students learn about in school from the time they are very young, whenever they learn about history. It's an important movement. There's a lot of pride associated with it in Ireland, in the Republic, even a little bit in the North as well. And it's fondly thought of, and it's memorialized, and there are popular narratives that go along with it. So what happened was just kind of what I just said. There was a rebellion, Irish rebels versus British soldiers in 1916 on the streets of Dublin, and it took place over a week. The Irish rebels eventually did lose and concede. However, it sparked a lot of other movements and eventually led to the beginning of Irish independence in 1921, several years later. But 1916, again, is that first spark. And we celebrated the 100th anniversary in Ireland just last year in 2016. So there was a lot of interest in that history, which sparked a lot of participatory projects. So I wanted to know what motivated participants to attend the Inspiring Ireland 1916 event. So I did semi-structured interviews with researchers, when I say researchers, the attendees, about their object and why they attended. Then I did qualitative data analysis with coding and memoing to come up with some results. And this is what it looked like. So the DRI had pre-scheduled some participants to attend the Inspiring Ireland event. This was maybe other events, like they would hold an event at a popular location, and people would say, well, I have this really cool thing, and they'd bring it in, and some of it they would be like, okay, this doesn't, I don't know if this is authentic, or it's not going to work. But anyway, they picked the best examples they could find from those preliminary events, and they pre-scheduled everyone. So participants would arrive at the site with their objects. They would speak to a volunteer, one of our students, who would gather metadata about the object. People would tell a story, they'd take notes and so forth. Then the object was given to a curator for digital capture. So while these people were waiting, they were offered refreshments. But this is where I kind of would swoop in and say, hi, you have 20 minutes. Would you like to talk to me about why you're here today? And this worked really well. They kind of just gave me a table in the corner. And I attended 3 of these events, and it worked really well. And people were just waiting, and they were very happy to tell me their stories. So I eventually did, spread over 3 collection days, 2 in Dublin, 1 in London. 20 interviews with 29 participants, and there were more participants in interviews because often some of the participants would come as families, so they would come in pairs or maybe a family of 4 or 3 people, and we would just do one interview, so one interview per object or object that was brought in. So what I was able to do was I was able to identify 2 different kinds of motivation. There was perceived individual benefits for attending the event and perceived communal benefits for attending the event. And it sort of broke down like this. So the first 3 were individual benefits. And I've labeled these sharing, people wanted to share their story, they were interested motivated by preservation and remembering, and they were motivated to find out more. Then there was this other one, they were motivated by this idea of open access and sharing. So 3 individual benefits and 1 communal benefit. I'll tell you a little bit about those now. So these benefits have, I've given them a title, but they're very complex. And this first one, a lot of people wanted to share their story, and I would talk to them, and they would tell me about how important it was to tell their story. But when I parsed the data, and I kept going through it several times, as one does with qualitative data analysis, I found it was actually more about control. It wasn't about sharing a story, it's about controlling the story. So it was, I want to share my story to control the narrative in my family's role. So for example, often many of these artifacts were family artifacts. Not all, by any means. But someone would come and tell their family story, and I would ask them why they were here, and they would say, because people need to know what my family did. And people need to know what my family's role in this was. So that was one thing. And then there was this idea of controlling who is highlighted in the remembrance. So again, and you can think of common historical stories that we all like to think about, and I'd say popular cultural history, like Washington crossing the Delaware or something like this. And we all know maybe Washington was a central figure, but maybe we don't know who those underlying figures are, the women, the minorities, the non-gentry type people. So there was a lot of people there who spoke about how important it was to remember these people who weren't the leaders of the rebellion. Everybody knows who James Connolly is. Everyone knows who Patrick Pierce is. These are all names that are incredibly common, and every school child in Ireland would have learned about them, but they wouldn't necessarily have learned about the women or the unnamed soldiers or even the civilians who were caught up in this urban warfare. So a lot of people wanted to highlight that. So in particular, for example, there was a brother and sister who were there sharing some of their father's material. Their father was a doctor at the hospital who was treating some of the rebel soldiers when they came in. He was also treating some of the civilians. And they were saying that those who were treating the wounded were often not credited. So it was this idea of controlling who gets the credit and who's highlighted. Then there was this idea of controlling the popular story. As I've said, everyone knows it took place in Dublin. There was about 5 guys who led the rebellion, and that's kind of whatever, like, that, if you were walking down the streets of Dublin asking an Irish person, that's kind of where it would stop, right? But of course, there's always so much more. Specifically, there were people from outside Dublin and the other counties who were very interested in telling the story of how this other county participated in the rebellion, because and one of my participants would say, well, everybody thinks it just happened in Dublin, but it didn't just happen in Dublin. It happened in Kerry too, and nobody ever recognized that it happened in Kerry. Or it happened in Limerick, and nobody recognizes that Limerick played a role. Limerick sent soldiers. So it's this tying to place, but it's also trying to change that popular story. Now, what's really interesting is this idea of wanting to attend, their motivation was preservation and remembering, but not in the way that we would necessarily think about it. And this is one I think that challenges you to step outside of your own shoes, especially if you're a student or someone who is in this area. Preservation and remembering is like fun, right? We're all here because we like this. But most people don't like this. If I've learned anything from talking to people about personal information management, is most people just look at this act of preservation and remembering. A lot of people look at it as a burden. Specifically the preservation. The remembering, more people enjoy that, but the preservation is the burden. So people were there because they were seeking relief from a burden. And a lot of this was somebody would talk about their neighbor, who they were very close with, or a close family friend, who had left them an object in a will. And they had this object and they felt really guilty because they never did anything with it. And okay, finally there's an opportunity where I can just make sure that it's going to go online and I can like just take a breath and I've done my duty. And this is what this was a lot. And people described it as a once-off, like I'm one and done. I've done everything I need to do. I feel like I've done my grandfather proud. I want to get out of here as soon as I can. and this is, we don't think that this motivates people to come to an archive or participate, but a lot of people said this. It's really interesting. Now, there was another one about information seeking, and generally I want to find out more. And this is the super common why people come to an archive or engage with archival materials. But what's interesting here is this only happened in London. Only the participants in London talked to me about this. And if you think about it, it's actually not surprising because in Ireland, again, 1916 would be in the curriculum several times before, from like age 4 to age 17. Not so much in London. And especially unless you're specializing in Irish history, you're not going to hear a lot about this. And if you do, you're going to get an entirely different perspective. And a lot of people talked about that, this different perspective. And I should say these categories are not mutually exclusive. So everybody didn't fit nicely in a box, as they never do with qualitative research. So there was this idea of controlling the remembrance of there were actually people in London participating. And I know this, and there were talks happening. And they were sending money over. So it was that of course went to that first one. But this is, I don't know anything about Irish history, and I feel a little ashamed about it because I have a lot of Irish relatives and I want to learn more. And that's why I'm here. Or I know a little bit, or I know enough, and I'm very proud of it, and that's why I'm here. I'm proud to be in London and be a Dubliner in London or an Irish person in London, which is actually really interesting because I'd say that's more of a recent kind of behavior. You wouldn't have necessarily seen that as much 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, the 50-year remembrance. Okay, so then we come to our other one. This is, again, the only communal one. And I would say, if I asked most people before I started, they would say that this was probably going to be the motivating factor, right? That people, we're all about open access, and we fight for it. And obviously our participants want it and believe in it as we do. And some of them did speak about, I'm here to share something because it should be free. And another participant would say, if I contribute something and somebody else does, then we get to see all of this stuff. These ideas that almost exactly align with at least a lot of the values that I teach and we teach in information studies. But then there was this idea of trying to keep them away, the objects away from collectors, and this idea that if it's put online and it's freely available, it's a really nice way to keep it out of the hands of a collector who doesn't want to share it with anyone. And the collectors were kind of the evil people in this figure. They were either very wealthy collectors from the UK or America who are going to come and try to keep everyone, that general Irish person, away from having this access. So this was a motivation as well. So I was able to identify these 4 characteristics, and I wanted to know what those meant. So what does it mean if most of the participatory models, those models I mentioned in the first couple slides, assume or appear to assume a perceived communal benefit, but most participants report an individual benefit? So when I say that, so if we think back to those models, like Huvila's model, this idea of shared governance of an archive, who is volunteering to do this, right? Who are these volunteers that are coming out of the woodwork who are so passionate about these institutional archival collections that they're going to take all this on as volunteers, right? Maybe we know 1 or 2 about those, especially if some of you are working. Or who are these people who are going to be giving all this stuff to Shilton and Srinivasan to build their collections, and then they're going to appraise it as well in this model. So they're not only giving stuff, they're appraising stuff, and they're participating in focus groups. Who are these people? Are there a lot of them out there? And I think what a lot of these initial models struggle with is they assume that this participation is there. And if we've learned anything from something like DSpace, right, where I sat in this classroom when DSpace was just starting several years ago, and it was this build it and they will come model, right? So when I was reviewing my results, I had all this in mind, and I was thinking, who's going to be doing all this? And is it dangerous for us to assume that people are going to be participating just because we want them to? Or just because we ourselves might want to participate? Are we going to have enough people to participate? Are they going to do what we think they're going to do? So I think it actually brings up some larger issues. This is where I kind of veer off of most of what is established. I think we have a good for society language problem. So traditionally, when we look at justifications for cultural institutions, libraries, archives, museums, pretty much what I'm talking about, a lot of times when I see justifications for funding in particular, or for existence, they're based on a social justice or good for democracy model, loosely. And when I say model, I mean the language. Now, every time there's a Twitter war, or every time USA Today writes an article that says libraries librarian as a job is dying off, the field comes in and starts talking about how good libraries are or how good archives are for society. And that's what we tend to do. And I'm starting, and I used to do this too, and I'll say I was a director of a public library in New Hampshire, and I would have to stand up in front of town meeting and argue for my budget every year. And I would try this model, right? I would say your town is better off if more people are educated, if there is unfettered access to the internet, and there's more free material and a gathering space. And most of the selectmen would be like sit down, like we're not giving you money. I mean, and it was very blunt like that. And so I thought about that past experience, and I thought about this good for language model, and I say there's a long history of this, because if you look at some of Jesse Scher's early writing, I mean, and this goes back to the early 20th century, it's built on this libraries and archives and museums, they're all good for democracy. And we're going to justify our activities by contributing to this public good. And we can think about language of impact. This is actually a little bit about what my TED Talk will talk about. So when I see the cultural heritage sector try to respond to these things, to these attacks, let's call them, or misunderstandings, maybe that's a nicer word, it tends to focus on this good for society language or the impact language. And the impact language tends to be, we've done this, and the impact language is, or like, we served so many people this year, or we had this many people check out books, or this many people came through our doors. And that's very similar to a way a private company or a business would justify themselves. So we've got this bifurcated kind of justification going on here. And at its root, I think it, especially the good for society language, assumes altruistic motives. And these arguments would work, or they effectively, in theory, would work if most individuals had altruistic motives, and if most individuals were interested in communal benefits, right? So when you talk to someone about how libraries are good for society, and they believe in communal benefits of a library, you're speaking their language. But if my results tell you anything, the majority of my participants spoke about individual benefits. What are we doing to talk to those people? The people who are mostly motivated to interact in any way because of a perceived individual benefit. How are we talking to them? I don't think we are effectively. And this is how I'm extrapolating from my results. So how do we justify activities in a way that acknowledges motivation resting on perceived individual benefit? And I actually would say this is the big challenge now for the field. How do we figure out the motivation, or how do we figure out even how to talk to people who are motivated by individual benefits? So I think it's time to consider how to move from an overarching dedication to a public good to a consideration for personal benefit. And I know that sounds like probably awful and against everything everyone's ever learned. And I kind of like to do that. I like to throw some controversial things in there. But I do think it's time to look at things like that. And I actually think things like researchers who study climate change, communication. So there are a lot of researchers who will study how people perceive information about climate change, because a lot of people can't understand why someone can't accept climate change, right? And they've done lots of research about things like moral hazard theory, which posits that no, it's not that they don't understand the facts, it's that their moral actually is preventing them from understanding the facts in the way that people who perceive a communal benefit would. So I actually think there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and it kind of, the key thing that draws it together is this consideration for personal benefit. So that's all. I'm happy to answer any questions about anything, about the research, about UCD, about UNC's program, about Ireland in general. So, yeah.
Well, I'm happy to start out.
Okay.
Sort of two completely different comments. One, I had the good fortune in my life to work in the conservation lab at Trinity College, Dublin, and there was a blockbuster exhibition that traveled the United States for 2 years called Irish Treasures. So, and it was debated in newspapers because a lot of people felt treasures shouldn't leave Ireland because the British had already taken so many of them away, and if there was a plane crash, that would be the end of Irish heritage, right? But it seems to me that notion of treasures has maybe stuck around because we objectify the Book of Kells and various other artifacts, and it might be somewhat particular to Irish culture that they think of these treasures. So I don't know. I have no idea if that's true or if you ran into that, but I'm assuming that when you talk to people during those events, you would have had people of a certain age who might still be thinking in terms of treasures. So that's one observation. The other is someone who teaches or has taught library history. That's a very interesting point. Perhaps we're still stuck in the progressive era thinking and mindset, because a lot of these ideas of public good came out of the late 19th century, the Settlement House movement, Jane Addams, and the development of social work and American librarianship, and maybe we haven't evolved, and maybe it's time to evolve to another way of thinking about the benefit, to individuals of lands. So.
Hi, my name is Donna Weber, and I'm teaching the Archives program. As I listened to you, what I found very interesting is that you're coming to this from a research perspective and coming to certain conclusions. And most of my life was spent working as an archivist, and so I come up at a lot of these issues as a practitioner, and came to very similar conclusions, which was people who choose to be in an IT field tend to be very public service oriented. And so I think that the values we're talking about the importance of what we do for democracy, etc., these things all still work for me just fine, thank you. I don't need to change them for me. But I did learn to understand at a very early stage as a working archivist that these noble ideas that worked for me and motivated me to be in this field were not the things that mattered when I walked into an office and somebody's files were a mess and they wanted you to come and fix it. And if I came in and said, well, what really matters here is that we manage to organize and preserve your records so we have greater understanding of this institution and its place in posterity, is going to get me a very blank look. Right. But if I went in there and I said, let's figure out how we can organize your files so they work really well for you, and then, by the way, they come to me in a really orderly fashion, which helps me do the noble work that I am engaged in, everybody was happy. And so when you were talking about this, I thought, as you were separating out what the professionals wanted and what the people who were contributing for all their various reasons were it's still very much true. We have to find a way to communicate with them in a way they can hear, and we do that by learning to understand what it is they want. So that's what
Thank you. Okay. I was wondering if you had a sort of idea of what sort of language would best communicate the personal benefit, or like any shifting conversational practices too.
Yeah, and I don't know yet. So I'm actually starting on this work now, and I'm starting writing some large EU grants, hopefully, that will let me do that in a really detailed way. But looking at areas of people who do this, there's no one really in the cultural heritage sector that studies this. But as I said, the people who study like climate change and climate change science communication actually is really useful in this kind of thing, because they're dealing with people who just want to explain facts and people who don't accept those facts. And so the first thing they try is to just explain those facts more, and it doesn't work. So then they do things where they look for things like moral hazard theory. Is there a different way? Or a lot of this is becoming more popular now because of political issues. How do we talk to people who are of a different political strain from us? How can we have a meaningful conversation about one issue when we come at it with different political perspectives? So a lot of stuff in political science and science communication is what I'm reading. I haven't been able to come to any conclusions or even have maybe a hypothesis yet, but I know that it's a problem, and that's the first part, right? Identifying that there's a need, and that, again, most of my subjects were more interested in those individual benefits than the communal ones.
I was just going to ask, on your third or fourth slide, it cited forgetting as one of the values of home archiving.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could explain that a little bit, and also just whether or not that has a role in participatory archives, and if forgetting is a value that's, the motivation for that can be shared, or as an individual value, or where that would fall.
Yeah, so that was identified by Kirk and Sellen, but in some of my earlier work, I kind of could identify that as well. And this idea about the forgetting was I don't have to hold it in my head anymore because I've scanned it, or I've done something to it to preserve it in most people's minds, whether or not this is actual preservation or not. In their minds, they've done something to it, so they don't have to remember it anymore. That traces back to early work in personal information management, where it's this idea that I don't have to worry about it or hold it in my head. There's a relief associated with it. So in that example, forgetting is associated with relief. It's not like I can just pretend history didn't happen. It's I can kind of forget it in my short-term memory because I know it's taken care of in that way. And as far as in participatory projects, certainly some of my subjects were there because they wanted to forget and they wanted relief that came with forgetting. And it was like, I think somebody mentioned they'd lost things. Like, I was the person in my family in charge of the family papers and I lost them, or my dog did something to them, or my children did something to them. And at least I know if they're scanned and the DRI has them, and DRI was trusted. It was really interesting. People trusted it as a government repository. So it's this trusted place is going to scan it, and now I feel so much better because I don't have to be responsible. So it's a lot about not having to keep it in one's short-term memory and not having a feeling of being responsible for it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of, so I think that you're talking about forgetting in more of a sense of the relief of not having to worry about custody of the physical object anymore. But I wonder if the sense of forgetting ever extends to people individually or as a community wanting to be done with an event in a way, but feeling that it should be remembered. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I remember when I was here at Simmons, Jeanette had us reading about the Just a Bunch of Bigots article. Yes. Which was it was KKK records, and it's somewhere in Michigan, repository in Michigan. There was a big debate within this the local town, I remember correctly, about whether or not they wanted this to come to light, and how it was going to be framed and so forth. So I actually don't think that's an old argument. And I do think there are examples there. And I'm looking and I'm like, I remember this. It seemed like 12 years ago. There definitely are some examples of that there. And I think that was in a Richard Cox edited volume, if I'm not mistaken. And it has a lot of examples of that. There are certainly people who want stuff to stay hidden, but I think hidden is different from forgetting. And also you have to remember Kirk and Sellin used the word forgetting, but they're HCI people. So I think archives people might pick a different word. Or at least when I say archives people, I say the archives literature, you would see a different word like maybe hiding or concealing or something like that. So there is some difficulty with that word there, especially when you kind of go outside of, you go to different disciplines. If that makes sense.
Could you explain a little bit how the events themselves were kind of advertised or publicized or something? Because I think that I just want to have a better understanding of the types of people that they were trying to reach out to like come to events like that.
Sure. So RTE was one of their partners. RTE is the national television network in Ireland. So it's like kind of like the BBC. If you think of how the BBC works, RTE kind of works in the same way. So there would be our advertisements on the RTE website, the RTE guide, maybe I think did some popular press. There would be press all over. There was the government post office was a very important historic site for 1916, but it's actually still a post office. So I think a couple of Saturdays, they actually just set up a table there. And a lot of tourist groups would visit that, and people interested in the history would visit that because they had started doing a little mini exhibit there. So we were trying to get a lot of that attention. Anywhere there would be kind of a 1916 event, there were some DRI people there doing these initial kind of come, meet and greet, bring your item kind of things. And they tried to do, it was a lot of it in Dublin, but they did try to do it geographically all over Ireland and in Belfast too.
Could you describe some of the items that they were bringing?
Sure. So anything from letters and postcards from prisoners. The rebels went to a prison in Wales called Ffrangach, and there were some edited postcards, the blackout where you cut out strips. There was a crucifix that was incredibly valuable that was a priest used to deliver last rites to some of the rebels, and was passed down from like the priest to an altar boy to the altar boy's children and their children and their children. And so the crucifix was a main item. There were some scrapbooks. There were some ticket stubs from talks that Patrick Pearse had given. There were a lot of photographs. There was a brother and sister who collected memorabilia of the Ashe family. And so the Ashe family raffled off like everything they owned to try to pay for some legal help for one of the leaders of the rebel, Thomas Ashe. So they had some ticket stubs from the raffle, and they had one of the big things was like his motorcycle he was known for, and so they had some ticket stubs for the motorcycle. They had I think there's some memorabilia of Patrick Pearse's Irish language school. That was important because it was actually kind of a cover as a breeding ground for some of the young soldiers. So there was some memorabilia from that. The London event was a lot of photographs. There were some military medals. So at this time, you have to remember World War I was raging. So it was kind of like, at least a lot of Brits would see this as you're hitting England while it's down, because its military is already deployed on the continent in the trenches, and now you want to have a rebellion. So there was a lot of that popular, you would see that like political cartoons like that, so there would be a lot of that. So a whole spectrum. And actually you can log on to the Inspiring Ireland 1916 website to see some of the digital exhibits of some of the information that I've described. And it's placed side by side with institutional collections, which was DRI's goal.
Great, we can continue to talk informally over refreshments. So thank you very much.
Thank you.